Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today, this is going to be a pretty different video than usual because we are building a tier list. A tier list of Synologies throughout the years, mostly focusing on some recent ones, but also going back a little bit further. And I'm going to go through and rank all of these, cater through them in a random order. I've got my notes here, and we're going to be giving all of these units a rank from S to D tier, and it is at my own discretion, and basically how I feel about the product and how it's performed throughout the years, and things like that. So, S is going to be reserved for the top-notch units, the best of the best, the really solid ones. And then D tier are ones that just absolutely flopped or had some major flaws with them. So I'm really going to be focusing on these units with regard to who should buy them, right? So I'm not going to say, okay, the 3622XS Plus, that's $3,000. That's a horrible investment for a small business with 5 terabytes of data. No, I'm going to be focusing on for the person who needs these. And so a lot of these are not great at Plex. And I'm not going to talk about that because it doesn't matter for the right person who's buying them. Quick interjection here in the middle of the video. If you didn't hear already, we have found a company that will make custom Hawaiian shirts. We're not making any money off of it or anything like that. But if you're interested in a custom SpaceX Hawaiian shirt and you want to pre-order before September 23rd, there's a link for that down in the description below. Just one thing to note. These have a very long lead time, so we're expecting to get the order shipped out and delivered to everybody sometime in December, so it is going to be a long lead time, but they look absolutely awesome, and we're really excited to get them, and they're to celebrate hitting 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So check those out in the link description, and back to the video. And so jumping right into it, the very first unit we're going to talk about is that DS3622XS Plus. And while this is a very expensive desktop unit, $3,000 if I remember correctly right out of the box, it's a really solid unit because that 36 moniker means it can have two 12-bay expansion units for a total of 36 drives. Now, it does require the Synology drives, but I gotta say, for a unit like this, I think there's very little competition, and it's got a ton of power under the hood. It is super quiet, it is desktop, and it is really, really, really useful. So I'm going to give that A tier because the ability to just have half a petabyte standing on a desk that's pretty quiet is really hard to beat. With upgrading this thing to 36 gigs of RAM, it also allows you to build a single volume over 108 terabytes, up to 200 if I remember correctly. And so there is something about that it makes it incredibly versatile for people who are looking at that price point. This unit is not for everybody. This unit is for very few people, but I've deployed a few of these things because there's just nothing else out there that gives you the ability to have desktop storage with Synology OS on it and the ability to expand to half a petabyte of data. With all that, it's really hard not to give that A tier, even though it is expensive, and it does require Synology drives, which is that big downside. You can obviously deploy it without Synology drives and get the warning, which I have done multiple times, but I really like this unit, even though it is expensive. Next up on our list is actually going to be another A tier. It is the DS1813 Plus. And the only reason I'm leaving it as A tier is the fact that about every 3 months, I get on a call with a client and they are running one of these still. It is unbelievable to me how well these things have lasted. And I'm going, do you ever notice it being slow? And they're like, no, it runs great. Yeah, the CPU is slow, but honestly, it works. If we pull up the info sheet for it, it's hard not to love. It comes with 4 1 gigabit Ethernet ports on the back of it. It can scale up to 72 terabytes with 2 expansion units for a total of 18 drives, go up to 4 gigs of RAM. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here to love, and the thing is, it is still running in a lot of units today. Now, I will say, whenever I do come across these things, unless they are completely and totally firewalled off and there's no external access to them ever and it is just raw storage, I really do not recommend running one of these. Anything that's still running on DSM 6.2 and before, which is what these guys are running if I remember correctly, is just, you really probably should switch off and get to a more modern version. But something that's lasted for 12 years is pretty hard not to dock. And honestly, for people just working in a closed office environment, just needing a basic file server, it's got everything. The only thing it does not have on here is under file systems, it does not have BTRFS, so you don't get any of those lovely snapshots. You're only stuck to ext4. But for a basic office file server, it is still plugging along, and while the CPU is pretty poor, honestly, it can saturate a gigabit network connection, so it doesn't really matter for a lot of businesses who are using it just as a document store. But yeah, this unit, I have to give it that because for whatever reason, a ton of people are still running them and they're happy with them. They're just often calling me to say, it's probably about time to upgrade. I don't think anybody's looked at that in a few years. And I get on there and I'm trying to remember back how to use DSM 6.2, even sometimes at DSM 5, and I'm like, I have no clue where anything is here. But because of all that, I have to give the DS 1813 Plus into A tier. Anything that has that kind of longevity is a great investment in my opinion. All right, so we started off with 2 A tiers and we cannot continue on that path. I think I've got to give the DS 620 Slim C tier, and I know there's a lot of people who love this. And I know I said at the beginning of this video that I was not going to be docking points for people buying the wrong product, but the thing is these units are really hard to love. For an all SSD unit, which is what you'd expect out of a 2.5-inch unit, it is just really underpowered. Dual core, slow CPU, slow RAM, and the maximum performance is 200 megabytes per second, reading and writing with an encrypted share. For a 20 unit that is all SSD, it is just really, really, really hard to understand why this exists. You could say, and I have had clients deploy them with hard drives. So you can still buy laptop 2.5-inch hard drives, spinning disks. But then you beg the question of why? Because I believe the maximum size you can get on those is 4 terabytes. And so this profile is about the same profile as a 923 Plus or 920 Plus, which is 4 hard drives. Well, you can store way more data on 4 3.5-inch hard drives than you can on 6 2.5-inch hard drives. So I know there are people out there who really like these units, and I'll be honest with you, I don't understand it. And so I have to give that down to D tier just because these units, while they are designed for SSDs, are incredibly slow and underpowered, which make them just kind of hard to understand why they exist, especially given that you could get a much more flexible unit that has way more power. I would understand these units if they had a pretty powerful CPU in them. And then it's justified of saying, hey, yeah, it's all SSD, so reasonably you can pull 1 gigabyte of data per second out of it with a 10 gig NIC. Great, super slim. But instead they put these very underpowered CPUs in them, which they have done for multiple of these slim units, that just make the entire product here not make any sense in my opinion. All right, so unfortunately the 620 Slim, while it doesn't have any technical massive issues with it, it is absolutely C tier material in my opinion, even though I do know a lot of people are running them. Moving on to the DS 1821 Plus, and there's no question about it in my opinion, I've got to go ahead and put that into S tier. If I only had one S tier to give, it would have to be the DS 1821 Plus. I absolutely love this unit. I probably recommend 4 of them a week on client consulting calls, just because price to performance to flexibility, it is really hard not to recommend. Desktop unit that can hold 100 terabytes in its main bay easily, takes any hard drives you want to throw at it, has the ability to expand to 32 gigs of RAM, 10 gigabit or even 25 gigabit networking. There's just so much stuff that this thing can do. It's got 2 built-in NVMe slots and the ability to have 2 more 5A expansion units on it. It is just a really solid unit, and it makes it really hard to recommend anything else because it just has that really great price to performance to flexibility ratio that is great. It's one of those cases where a business can spend an extra $300 upgrading to this unit versus something like a 1522 Plus, and quite literally may double the life expectancy of their unit because this one has the ability to just expand to so much more storage and be so much more flexible. And so that's why I really love it. It allows you to expand out later on. You start with 4 hard drives, realize you want 4 SSDs in there, boom, you can do that all without having to get an expansion unit or anything like that. If y'all watch this channel, you know I am always talking about this because I just think it's a great unit. And it is perfectly contrasted with the FS 1018, which is in no question D tier material. This unit has just, in my opinion, no place to exist. It was expensive, a flash station desktop model with a dual core Intel Pentium CPU in there. This unit was unbelievably underpowered. I was able to go light on the DS620 Slim because it's a slim unit. It's not a FS unit, a flash station unit, so it's really not expected to have great performance. You're not buying it for the utmost performance. It's a slim unit, right? That's the marketing, that's where it's designed, and that's its price point. This FS 1018 was $2,000 at launch and could not saturate a 10 gigabit network connection with all SSDs. If we look at the product sheet here, it is one of those units that does not mention overall throughput of the system in any way. The only thing it mentions are write IOPS and things like that, because it simply has horrible sequential performance with an SMB share. So you'd think a unit like this would be great for a video production house or a fast office file server. You can transfer large files all the time. That's kind of what you think of when you think flash station. Instead, this unit really could not saturate a 10 gigabit connection because it was just hamstrung by an incredibly slow Pentium CPU. And for a flash station series, that's just not acceptable. This unit was $2,000. They should be able to put a solid CPU in there that is actually going to be able to run fast. I really think in a way they almost started this unit out as a slim model, but then decided, no, it could be a flash station series. This is one of those units that I had a couple of clients call me to kind of set up and increase their performance on because it was lackluster. I'm like, listen, I know this is like supposed to be a high-end unit. It just does not perform that well. And it's just one of those things that caused genuine problems and was way underpowered, especially given its point on the price tier list. And so because of that, there's nowhere else for the FS 1018 to be than the D tier list. You'll see that I believe that is the last time a flash station desktop unit has been created. Now, I bet with the invention of U.2 drives and a bunch of stuff like that, we could probably see a lot more coming on the market in 2024, 2025 timeframe. But this FS 1018 has absolutely been abandoned by Synology, and I think they're trying to kick it under the rug because that is one of those units that is absolutely deserved of D tier. Next up, we have the DS1621 Plus. And the DS1621 Plus is a DS1821 Plus with 6 bays. That's it. Same CPU, same specs, same everything. And the thing is, there's only a $100 price difference between these two units. And so because of that, I would put the 1621 Plus in a solid B tier. Honestly, the $100 price increase to go from the 1621 Plus to the 1821 Plus makes it very hard to justify the 1621 Plus in a lot of cases. That's because having those 2 extra bays increases the flexibility of your NAS by a massive amount. And for the vast majority of businesses, in my opinion, will save them money in the long term. $100 is a very small price to pay, considering how expensive a full-blown NAS setup is, with the most expensive part being your hard drives. And so having that ability to spend an extra $100 to the DS1821 Plus and get 2 more hard drives, so that's an extra 32 terabytes of space if you're going 16 terabyte drives, makes this really hard to justify. And it's not a bad unit by any means, but spend the extra $100 to get that bigger unit that will last you a good bit longer, saving you a good amount of money in the long term. So because of that, there's no problems with the unit, but it's just a B tier unit. It is a fine unit that just has better options in the product stack. Now moving on to the DS1515 Plus, and the reason I included this is the entire 15 lineup. If you do not know why the DS1515 Plus unit is on this list, you may not have heard of the Intel Atom C2000 series bug. And the 1515 was just an easy unit to pick out for this. There was also the 1815 and a couple other units that Synology had that had this Intel Atom C2538 CPU in them. A fine CPU on paper, except for the fact that Intel had a hardware bug in them that essentially caused a specific timing clock circuit to run something like 1,000,000 times more often than it was supposed to. And what would happen is that timing circuit would eventually burn out because it was never designed to be run that many times. That timing circuit had only one purpose. It was supposed to provide clock at boot. So these units that had this C2000 bug would work totally fine. They'd be fine units until they needed to boot up. So if you rebooted it to update or anything like that, all of a sudden it will not boot because the CPU has literally degraded itself and the timing circuit required to boot no longer exists. And this was not Synology's fault, this was Intel's fault. These CPUs ended up in a lot of other kind of hardware, like some firewalls had a bunch of issues, but it was one of those surprise problems that just causes your NAS one day not to be able to boot. And so because of that, all of these are in D tier. Now I should also mention, there was a hardware duct tape fix for these units where you could apply a specific resistor in a specific part of the chip that would essentially allow it to keep running for a while longer. You're still running that circuit too many times, so it's still degrading further, but it would allow them to boot well enough. And so that is a fix. So one other thing I should mention, any of these 15 units, so this 15 series, you should really watch out before buying any of them on eBay. They come really cheap, but a lot of these probably just have that resistor fix on them, and that is not a permanent solution. The CPU is fundamentally flawed and will eventually burn out again no matter what. And so don't go and buy these because they're a good deal, because you may wake up in a few months from now and have them not boot just in the exact same way. And so just look up the Intel Atom C2000 series bug and you will find which units have them and just stay away from them. The problem with this bug is it was a hardware issue, so there was no way to patch a firmware update or anything like that. And so the only way to fix it was to RMA the unit, and they built new C2000 series CPUs that did not have these problems. So just watch out for those because, well, they were a huge issue, and that is why it is firmly in D tier, along with the other units from that series that caused that problem. Next up, a unit that is near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, the DS920 Plus. I think this is a unit that is absolutely A tier. It is a great Plex box. It came out at a great time, and I think it was a lot of people's first NAS. I think a ton of people bought the 920 Plus and got into NASs right at that time. So I think it was just a really solid unit, really versatile, had an Intel QuickSync GPU in there. So essentially the CPU had a small GPU on there that handled hardware transcoding for Plex, meaning that it could absolutely punch above its weight class for the CPU. This is just a unit that a lot of people started with and has allowed people to tinker into Docker and virtualization and things like that at a pretty cheap price point. I think this unit, for whatever reason, was the one that a lot of home labbers got started with, and because of that, it's got to be A tier. It is just a very solid unit for that. Next up, we have the counterpoint to the DS3622XS Plus, the DS2422 Plus. And this is one of those units that's just hard to recommend. Essentially, this is a DS1821 Plus with 12 built-in bays rather than 8. And it has the ability to have a 12-bay expansion unit, which is a phenomenal size of an expansion unit. 5-bay expansion units on the 1821 Plus and the 1621 Plus, and actually a lot of these units, are just meh, in my opinion. Because when you're expanding, you often want more than just 5 bays. The problem that arises with the DS2422 Plus is two different things. So one, it requires Synology drives, whereas the 1821 Plus does not require Synology drives. The 2422 Plus does, unfortunately. And because of that, this is a substantially more expensive unit if you're planning on buying Synology drives and keeping your volume from going orange. I will say this Plus unit does take the new Plus series Synology hard drives, which are essentially in line price-wise with Iron Wolf hard drives. However, they are maxed out currently to 16 terabytes. So it is a much better cost proposition than it has been in the past, but you're still pretty limited. But that's not the real reason why it's on this list and where it's about to end up. The biggest problem with this unit that makes it very hard for me to give it a good place in the world is the fact that the volume is limited to 108 terabytes. So a 12-bay unit with 12 16 terabyte hard drives in a RAID 6 configuration, pretty normal deployment, would have an internal storage pool size of 160 terabytes. However, this unit does not allow you to build a volume above 108 TB. So if you want to use your 12 drives, you have to split into 2 volumes, which means you can't have a single shared folder that is larger than 106 TB. And while this is fine for some people, it is incredibly annoying and just feels like a massive limitation on a unit of this size and caliber. Now, I will say I have deployed this unit before for video production houses who are not going to come close to that volume size, but really want maybe 80 terabytes of archival space, along with like 15 terabytes of SSD super fast editing space. Having 12 bays in the unit does make that pretty possible and very useful, but it's still pretty hamstrung overall. And so I've got to drop it down to C tier, just because a unit of that size should not be limited to 108 terabytes in a single volume. That is a massive limitation when you're talking about a 12 bay unit, when there are 22 terabyte hard drives and even 24 terabyte hard drives on the market today. The 108 terabyte limit is also present on all of these smaller units except for the 3622 XS Plus. However, they don't have 12 bays. They've got at most 8 bays, which makes it a lot harder to really get there and be annoyed by it, especially once you hit RAID. But when you've got 12 drives, it becomes very easy to be annoyed by that limitation. And now closing off our list, we have the DS1522 Plus. And I've got to give this A tier. It does have an annoyance of not having a standard PCIe card built in. So instead it's got that mini card, but I will say I have clients who absolutely love how easy it is to install a 10 gig NIC on there. And for people who are not super technically savvy, it is 10 times easier to install that 10 gig NIC on these units than it is to install it with the full size PCIe card. And so for the specific market share who's looking for something like this, doesn't care about SFP Plus, I think it's a very good place to be. The other thing is it comes with 8 gigs of RAM out of the box, which makes it a really good value proposition. 4 gigs tends to be enough for Synology DSM, but 8 gigs allows you to do extra stuff. Run a basic virtual machine, add in some of the more RAM heavy applications without slowing down. Plus it takes 2 5-bay expansion units. Overall, it's a unit I just feel like is really tried and true, and once again is worth the upgrade from its little brother, the DS923 Plus. Same specs across the board, except for the fact that this one has 5 bays internal, has 4 extra gigs of RAM, and has the ability to have 2 5-bay expansion units rather than 1. So I just love the DS1522 Plus, really versatile. I think there's a ton of flexibility that you get when you have a 5-bay NAS that you just don't get with a 4-bay NAS. You can increase your volume size with RAID 5 by about 33%, which is substantial. And you also just get a lot more flexibility, and doubling the RAM is really nice too. So because of that, those are my A tier NAS units. They are spread out throughout time and history, and all of them have a very good place for a specific person. And I absolutely have to leave the DS1821 Plus as my single S tier because that unit is just phenomenal in my opinion, and is a unit that honestly I have trouble not recommending in so many cases because of its flexibility. Alright, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to know if I missed any units. I just stuck to the desktop units here. I may do one with the Flash series and all the other rack mount units in the future, but let me know what I missed down in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye!